Neat freaking nation, what up? Welcome to the Droopy Whiskey channel, where we're talking about Knob Creek today. We're trying to answer the question, what is the deal with Knob Creek? We've answered the question, what is the deal with many other distilleries, many other products, and I have such a deep affection for Knob Creek that today I was like, you know what, let's devote a show and let's deep dive on this thing. Let's talk about the Knob Creek brand. Done this some on live streams. Talked about a few different Knob Creek products, specifically the single barrel and kind of the glory that the Knob Creek single barrel is. But we're going to talk more holistically about the brand, the space it occupies in the marketplace, and the new premium release, new as of last year, the Knob Creek 15, which I just procured. So I'm jacked to get into this. Really, really jacked. I don't have any of the standard Knob Creek. It's a solid bottle, but I have such a love for the variations of Knob Creek that I don't really need the standard one, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Before we do that, before we get into the standard Knob Creek and the evolution of the brand, the origins of the brand, yada, 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 get down in the show notes below if you want more content from the Droopy Whiskey channel. Join me on Thursday nights here at this channel where I live stream with my boy, my good friend, Brian Bikey at Abandoned Bourbon. That's his channel. I've linked that down below. You should check that out. And you can get barrel picks from us if you're a member of our Patreon community, patreon.com/entryproofpodcast. Again, link is in the show notes below. And one other thing you should probably do is follow me on Instagram. Periodically, I'll do a little live review on there. It's a way you can get bonus content. So just jump over to Instagram at Droopy Whiskey. Okay, now let's get into the content. What's the deal with Knob Creek? Well, let's start back in 1992. That's the year of origin. That's the birth year. So Knob Creek as a product is almost as old as I am. I'm an 89 guy. George Bush was still president. Here we're into the Clinton era, at least, when Knob Creek is born. This is post the launch of Booker's, but is really in the advent of the premium small batch bourbons coming out of the bad days, the dark times, the dark ages of bourbon. Late 80s, early 90s is where we start seeing some pickup, some renewed interest. Certainly things aren't going to go bananas for another 20 years or so, but we start to see some more steady growth, some product innovation. Come to 1992, we've already got Booker's as a barrel-proof, punch-you-in-the-face, small batch release from Jim Beam. And then the folks at Beam, the Nose, at this time Booker and Fred, they're like, okay, let's go, let's extend this line a little bit, and let's drop a unique product. A unique because Knob Creek, when it was released, was the oldest Jim Beam product at 9 years, like oldest standard release, because Booker's was actually younger in the 7-8 year range. It was initially released at 100 proof, but one of the unique things about Knob Creek, and I just actually learned this recently, is that Knob Creek tastes different. It's not as nutty as Jim Beam, as Booker's, even as Baker's, and a reason for that may very well be that it actually comes off the still at a lower proof than the juice that is used for standard Jim Beam products and for Booker's. Again, I did not know this until recently. Got to give credit down to Chuck Cowdery, kind of OG bourbon sage, journalist at the very least. I'm going to link his article down below where he actually talks a little bit about the origin of the Knob Creek brand, going back to National Distillers, which Beam acquired in the late 80s. The Knob Creek brand started in like 1930, lost to the sands of time until the folks at Beam decided to use that brand from National Distillers, which they acquired in the late 80s for their 1992 small batch release of Knob Creek. So Knob Creek, coming off the still slightly lower than Jim Beam. Same mash bill though. Standard Beam mash bill, you've probably seen it many times. We're talking 77% corn, so high corn, 13% rye, which is kind of surprising given the Jim Beam profile, which is pretty spicy, pretty nutty. Normally I would associate that with higher rye in the mash bill. Not so much here. 13% is very standard, very, very close, if not identical to Heaven Hill. Maybe Heaven Hill's 12%, so super, super close. And then 10% malted barley. You tend to see 8 to 12% being the standard barley mix, malt mix in a bourbon mash bill. So specs. I just gave you the mash bill. 9 years old. Mentioned that. 100 proof. One other thing that maybe makes this unique in terms of Beam's process is that when they're selecting barrels, they're looking for middle tier barrels, apparently. The Rickhouse, standard Beam Rickhouse has 9 floors, and they're saying no to the top 2, no to the bottom 2, giving 5 floors of availability to select for the Knob Creek profile. Within that slightly lower off the still proof. It still goes into the barrels at 125 proof, which is the maximum proof you can put distillate into a barrel and call it bourbon. But it seems like that lower proof point coming off the still has impacted the flavor and mellowed out some of the nuttiness compared to standard Beam or even the Booker's profile, which quite frankly, I'm a big fan of. So you're left with, in the standard 9-year-old OG edition of Knob Creek, decent level of caramely sweetness. You get a cornbread note for sure. You get some peanut, but it's pretty sweet. It's like candied confectionery peanuts in a trail mix or something. I heard one other reviewer call it honey roasted peanuts. I thought that was a fairly apt description. And then you get some black pepper and maybe some nougat, maybe a touch of cherry, not really grapey, not reminiscent of Buffalo Trace. But it's not cherry forward like a Stag Jr. or a George T. Stag. It's more like how dried cherry shows up sometimes in Elijah Craig barrel proof. And I do find that Knob Creek and Elijah Craig, fairly similar profiles. Not a one-to-one, obviously. Knob Creek's probably a touch nuttier as a matter of course. But two products coming from different distilleries, the Elijah Craig brand and the Knob Creek brand, probably the closest to my opinion. One other point of history to note regarding Knob Creek is it was 9 years age stated for a long time, which was low compared to like an Elijah Craig, which was 12 years for the longest time, probably its direct competitor, but it's high for what we see today as standard age statements. Then in 2016, when all hell was breaking loose and age statements were dropping right and left, we lost the 12-year Elijah Craig age statement. We also lost the 9-year Knob Creek age statement. Now, thankfully, that did not last very long. In 2019, Beam announced, hey, we're bringing 9 years back, and it did show up on the shelf again in 2020, the 9-year age statement. And in the last few years, we've also seen an advent of all kinds of new Knob Creek products, some of which, to my right, we'll talk about in just a minute. But before we get to those, we have to even take a step back. So, thankfully, we're left with a product fairly similar to OG Knob Creek, and at a price point of $30 to $40, you can't really go wrong with the standard Knob 900 proof. It's bourbon, and it's kind of bourbon as it should be. Left in the barrel long enough, dynamic, oaky, sweet, spicy. Yeah. And if I didn't have 8 other Knob Creek variations, I would certainly have a bottle of standard Knob Creek lying around. So here's the interesting thing about Knob Creek. Not that everything else I just said wasn't interesting, but that product went unaltered and uniterated on for like 18 years. We didn't see Knob Creek variations or limited editions, whatever, until 2010. That's where we started to see the first brand adjacencies or brand extensions. And that started 2010 with a Knob Creek single barrel reserve, dropping at 120 proof. This also eventually began to be a product that you could do single barrel store picks of, which we have all enjoyed and loved. Standard age statement on this is 9. Price does go up, whereas the OG is $30 to $40. This one you generally see $40 to $50. Now I'm starting to see it in the $60 range, particularly for store picks. Generally you're just turning up the volume on standard Knob Creek. That said, a couple years ago, it was like 2017 was the high point for the Knob Creek single barrel store picks, where the market was flooded with 13, 14, 15-year-old Knob Creek single barrel store picks that were still in that $40 to $60 range. And that's, I think, where people started, at least bourbon geeks in this new era of bourbon, started to pay closer attention to this brand. Because those store picks, some of them were unbelievable. I mean, world-class whiskey for $40 to $60. Now, it was short-lived, and we talked a little bit about this on the live stream last night. The night before I'm recording this with Brian Bikey, we talked about, it's a bummer now when we talk about 12-year Knob Creek and 15-year Knob Creek because they're expensive compared to those single-barrel store picks, when really those 13 to 15-year-old store picks, those were just a blessing. Those were a gift. And I think that the folks at Beam Suntory may have been saying, you know what, we want to signal that this brand is premium, and we're going to make way for some more standard age-stated releases. So what we're going to do is we're going to show everybody how awesome this is and give them a taste of 15-year-old Knob Creek for $40 to $60, and we liked what we tasted generally. I don't know anybody who was not a fan of those very, very high-age single-barrel store picks that we had. Nowadays, we're back in a standard of 9 to 10-year-old-ish for the store picks that I've seen. That said, they're still bangers. Not all Knob Creek store picks are created equal. Find yourself a store you trust their palate. If you're looking for a killer Knob Creek pick, I got a store like 15 minutes from me. I know that at any given time I can go get a pick from them, a Knob Creek pick, and it's gonna be fire. Moving on from 2010, 2 years later, we see the next brand line extension with the Knob Creek Rye. Not this one. I just talked about that. This one. Not this one, actually. It's different than this. This is the Knob Creek Cask Strength Rye, which this sucker dropped in 2018. But the original, 2012, was not cask strength. It's 100 proof. And it's non-age stated. Whereas the single barrel reserve Knob Creeks, the store picks, the standard 100 proof Knob Creek 9, those were all age stated. The Knob Creek Rye, the 100 proof standard one, was the first Knob Creek product that came without an age statement. Now, it lived in the same price point as standard Knob Creek bourbon, so we're talking $30 to $40. And that was one of the first ryes I had, maybe apart from Sazerac, when I was getting into bourbon, and I really, really liked it. Like, it's not super high rye, so it's Kentucky rye. It's kind of a bourbon drinker's rye. That one's 55% rye, so just 4% more than the minimum. 35% corn and 10% malted barley. So if you like standard Knob Creek, you're probably going to like the Knob Creek Rye. Just a little bit spicier, a little bit more herbaceous, maybe a touch less sweet. In 2018, we saw the release actually of the single barrels for the rye. I don't think the single barrels are released I don't think they're released apart from doing store picks. So you can do store picks of Knob Creek Rye, and those are released at 115 proof, and those tend to live in the 5 or 6 year age range, which leads me to believe that the standard Knob Creek small batch rye is probably in that 5 to 6 year age range. Not unusual to see a distiller's standard rye released at a lower age than their standard bourbon. Very, very normal, because it seems like you can get away with less aging in a rye and still deliver a lot of flavor. The price point on those Knob Creek single barrel ryes does jump up a little bit. It's in that $50 range, and they're fine. I've had some good ones. I don't rush for them. I actually reach for Knob Creek single barrel bourbon over the single barrel rye. I prefer it, but if you're a rye junkie, definitely wouldn't overlook it. Killer value. In 2013 now, not now, but then, like 8 years ago, almost 9 years ago, Knob Creek takes a hard left and does kind of a what the what. It leaves you scratching your head a little bit, but the Beam brand, Beam Distillery, is not shy when it comes to making bourbon liqueurs. Jim Beam. There's what? Jim Beam vanilla, Jim Beam apple, peach. I'm sure I'm missing some. But then Knob Creek gets in on the liqueur fun with the smoked maple in 2013. It's a lower proof product, and I think dilutes the glory of an otherwise premium, like small batch bourbon brand. It's like, why? It's not made with pure maple syrup, so it's maple flavored, fortified bourbon with sugar, wood flavor, and maple flavor. If you're looking for a flavored bourbon that seems not bottom shelf, I guess it kind of fits that niche because there's not really premium flavored bourbons out there. Well, I guess now there is in Knob Creek Maple. But I think they should have just developed a whole new brand. That's just my 2 cents. I'm sure they've got it pretty well doped. Probably not hurting for marketing opinions. While it's not like available everywhere, it's not unusual to see Knob Creek Maple on the shelf, and it's not unusual for people just getting into bourbon to pick that off the shelf, not fully knowing what the product is. Post 2013, we're in full mega bourbon enthusiast mode, where limited editions are starting to drop more frequently, and people are starting to take advantage of the demand for premium products. Jim Beam's having some success with Booker's 25th anniversary release, which was legendary. Booker's Rye, which was legendary. And so given that success, Beam launches Knob Creek limited editions that kind of tank. Not bad bourbons, but not successful in the days they were released. Knob Creek 2001, Knob Creek 25th anniversary just kind of sit on the shelf for years. Like, they were available for quite some time. They're not available now, and I'm sure like over time the appreciation for those products will grow, but they didn't blow people away in the way that like the Booker's 25th anniversary bourbon did. And given a price point of north of $100 compared to standard Knob Creek releases being in the, 30 to 60 at the most, seemed like a big leap for that brand at the time. There wasn't a tier between those $30 to $60 products in the standard lines and the $100 to $125 price point they were hitting with these drops. Then we get into 2019 though. And I think this is where Knob Creek starts to leverage the success of the 15-year-old store picks that showed up kind of in 2017, early half of 2018. People really, really liked those and got a flavor for these well-aged knob drops. Put that on a t-shirt. And so when Knob Creek releases their 12-year-old 100 proof release in 2019, it's met with a decent amount of like, oh yeah, this is good. We want this. They released that as kind of a standard, like, hey, we're going to keep this in our line. It does get released in batches, so it's not always available. It's definitely not always available here in Wisconsin. I saw it down in Texas around when I was there over the last month. It's certainly priced at a premium above standard Knob Creek or even the single barrel reserve, generally $60 to $70 for the Knob Creek 12. But also, along with that, Knob Creek 12 at 100 proof, which, as I mentioned, was met with warmth and embracement. People embraced it. Enthusiasts embraced a 12-year 100 proof product at $60 to $70. That seems like a good value in today's market, and indeed it is. But then they released a cask strength version as well, and I think there have been a couple 3 different batches of the Knob Creek 12 cask strength put out. That one tends to run in the 70 to 90 range. That's what I've seen it on the shelf for. Again, not in Wisconsin, but I've got a couple of bottles of that because it's very, very good and will deliver all the flavors of undiluted 12-year-old Kentucky bourbon. Heck yeah, for under $100, it's a good deal. Actually, it's priced very comparably to Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, which it kind of tastes similar to. Good side by side. It would be interesting to do that blind, see if you could pick out the difference. So we're having a good old time then. And to go along with that, the Knob Creek 12, in 2020, we saw the first release of Knob Creek 15 at 100 proof. No Knob Creek 15 cask strength releases yet. But we have 15-year-old Kentucky bourbon priced right around $100. Released last year and released this year. This one's not a permanent extension, whereas the Knob Creek 12 doesn't say limited edition or anything on it. It just says Knob Creek 12. The Knob Creek 15-year-old does say right here at the top, limited edition. And it's only one batch per year so far. I enjoy this. Hang out for just a minute, and then I'm going to do a tasting through this particular product. This is... People have hemmed and hawed about this one. It's too oaky. That's not my opinion. It's oaky for sure. But I think it delivers a flavor profile, a uniqueness, and it harkens back to an age of long-forgotten whiskey, unaccessible whiskey in its profile that I think is worth paying for. And a 15-year-old bourbon at $100 is a good value in today's day and age, given that we're seeing, Calumet 15, Sam Houston 15, likely Barton Juice, priced in the 125 range, where we can get Beam straight from the source at 100. Yeah, I'm here for that. Then there's other things like the Blue Run 14, which is source Kentucky bourbon. That was north of 200. We've seen toted 15-year-old Kentucky bourbon, likely from Beam, get sold under a bunch of different brands for well over $100, ranging from 125 for like a Doc Swinson's 15 to, what was it? I think I saw 200 for Whiskey Drummer. So if Knob Creek's going to say, hey, we know we used to do the single barrels at cask strength at 15 years old, and we gave you a gift, which they did. Now, given the fact that we built this brand up, we're going to release 15-year age statement stuff on the yearly. We're going to charge you $100. That doesn't seem unreasonable to me. Sure, I'd like to have those single barrels back. I wish I would have bought more. But I also can't fault them for getting what the whiskey is worth and not giving it away. I mean, come on. So that brings us up to date. That's a fairly decent summary. I actually kind of blew past the Knob Creek Cask Strength Rye release. There were two of them. So 2018 and 2019. Batch 1 I prefer. That's the one I have. I've tasted batch 1 and batch 2. I'm into batch 1. I like it a lot. I didn't buy a backup, even though it's still around. You can still get this. It's a 9-year-old cask strength rye, Kentucky rye, at $60, 60 to 70, killer value. Can't beat that. You should get it if you can. Don't have it, like Kentucky rye, etc. There were a couple other funky Knob Creek releases. Knob Creek Quarter Oak, Knob Creek Twice Barreled, maybe one other that I wasn't as into. But generally speaking, what Jim Beam does under the Knob Creek brand, I'm here for. I really, really like it, and it continues to be, year after year, a good value, regardless of what they release. It's been a place that they've played around a lot with experiments, different products, and I think that that's pretty cool when you see a big distillery like Jim Beam trying to innovate, because bulk of what they sell is not Knob Creek. Granted, Knob Creek is a good mover for them. Bulk of what they sell is certainly not Knob Creek 15 or Knob Creek Cask Strength Rye. The bulk of what Jim Beam is doing is Jim Beam white label. That's how they make their bread. But I will say that they've earned a lot of respect among enthusiasts with the quality that they've delivered in the Knob Creek line time and time again. Now let's taste this Knob Creek 15. I popped this last night, had a little bit more right before dinner. Then I ate dinner, so I've had some pizza on the palate. Now we're going to revisit it one more time. I mentioned that some people think this is very oaky, maybe too much. I agree it's very oaky, but not too much. I think that this is a super unique, super premium product. The nose it's smoky. It's sweet, it's spicy, it's funky, it's not very nutty, which is kind of a surprise. It reminds me of times I've been able to try Dusty Wild Turkey, which I've had 2 or 3 times, like old Wild Turkey stuff. It is a little sharp for 100 proof. Like you kind of get some alcohol impact in your olfactory glands. That's just a little bit surprising given the age. I think that would probably be the main differentiator between the nose as it exists now and something like a Dusty Turkey. You get some like reminiscence of black licorice on the nose too, black pepper, like all kinds of dark stuff, but yummy, sweet, candy, drippy, dark stuff. Alcoholic, yummy, sweet, drippy, syrupy. Speaking of syrupy, the palate is, yeah. It's like if you mix maple syrup with red Twizzlers, which I'm a fan of. It's kind of pruny, like dried fruits, but juicy. It's not very bright, so we're not really in the cherry department unless... Yeah, cherries are just too tart. It's more pruny. It's more like a dried plum. Don't think about prunes... Like prunes get a negative connotation because they're supposedly supposed to help you poop, but they're actually quite delicious. And I do like it when the note shows up in a bourbon, particularly a bourbon that has had no wine influencing wine finishing. The smokiness and spiciness and sweetness and touch of fruitiness, all kind of, when they come together, kind of reminds me of barbecue sauce. And I mentioned this in the live stream last night. It's kind of reminiscent of the Spanish oak finished American whiskey that we picked with Dancing Goat. We called it the Spaniard, but it's not that. That one's like pure barbecue sauce. This one's not at that level. The flavors are a little bit more separated, and they don't like amalgamize in that one like barbecue sauce note like the Spaniard did. But it's delicious. I kind of like everything about it. It's like burnt cornbread ends with honey all on it, but then it's spicy and savory. The oak is sweet. It finishes like a touch dry, but the finish goes on, like with all kinds of delicious notes. So there's nothing for me to hate about this, unless you just don't like oak in your bourbon. Then I could see you not liking it. If you're off-put by an oaky bourbon and you tend to like stuff that maybe tastes like standard Buffalo Trace, or maybe something that lives in the 6 to 8 year old range, like if that's where you find your money zone is, like a smoke wagon, uncut, unfiltered, then you might not like Knob 15. But I think if you like dusty bourbons, if you like well-aged oaky bourbons, if you like spicy bourbons, if you like complex bourbons, if you like bourbons in the 100 to 110 proof, if you can check any of those boxes, I don't see you not liking the Knob Creek 15. I'm a buy at it. I'm probably a buy at it up to 125. I think it's probably worth more than that in today's market. In today's market, we say generally $10 for every year it's aged is probably a good cost benchmark when it comes to ultra premium bourbons. So at 15 years old, $150 price point wouldn't surprise me. I hope it doesn't get that high because I might not buy it. But I would probably buy a backup if I saw it for less than 125. If you can get it for 100 or less, you should definitely do that because it's not going to stay at that price point. And I do think that the bourbon market will continue to get more and more hairy here as the years go on, at least over the next 5 to 10 years or so. A little bit of a light cigar, light tobacco finish as well. But yummy stuff. Y'all, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you watched it all, thanks for hanging in there. Appreciate it. Hope y'all have a good week. Stay healthy, stay safe, keep it neat.